Right now from Hot Air, I want to welcome to the program Jazz Shaw. Jazz, thanks for joining us today,
How
sir.
you doing, buddy?
I am excellent, man. Thanks so much. Really enjoyed your piece at Hot Air today, taking apart the New York Times article. New York banning gun ownership for more than 34,000 people without due process. These are people who have been deemed to be too mentally unstable to own firearms. Is this correct?
Well, that's their term, mentally unstable. Yeah, that is correct. As I wrote in the article, and I hope everybody gets a chance to look at that and the New York Times coverage, the New York Times actually did us a favor for a change, and they got a hold of something I've been trying to get a hold of for some time now, and they at least got acknowledgement. That's all we have so far, is acknowledgement from the government that there is a database with a list of people whose names have been added to this database in the state of New York because they have been reported by some, quote, medical authority. And as I've written previously, in New York, under the SAFE Act, that doesn't even have to be a doctor. That can be a therapist with a 4-year degree. Anyone who's had a prescription for any sort of people for things like depression can be reported and have their name added to that list. Once you're on there, your gun rights are suspended.
Okay, so you can get put on the list without knowing that you're being put on the list. How do you get off of the list, Jazz?
That's a great question, Cam. We have one example of one person from last year who did manage to get off the list. His name was David Lewis. Name is David Lewis, I should say. He lives outside of Buffalo, New York. And he, as you say, was put on the list. He was clearly, from the dates involved, he was one of the very first people that was put on the list. And he was put on there in error because there was someone else named David Lewis. The police showed up at his door, no warning, no notification. They had a warrant. They had papers in hand. They said, your license has been revoked. And he was a licensed firearm holder. Your permit has been revoked, and give up your weapons. Well, coincidentally, the other David Lewis also was a permit holder, apparently. And they just mistook the two. And they told him he could either give up his weapons or he could go to jail. So he gave them up. But he got a lawyer, and months later, after he had to pay his own attorney fees, he got his name removed from the list and it had to go all the way to a state Supreme Court justice to issue an order ordering the government to return his guns to him, which they finally did.
Wow. And this is what happens again if it's pretty clearly an error.
That was an
right?
error. We're not sure, Cam, how if they actually have your name correct, what your recourse is. Because in other states, and I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression, I am not in favor of the criminally insane people who have been convicted of gun violence and things like that having guns. I think there is a time when you suspend somebody's rights when they've proven that that they're just not responsible, not reliable, or in fact are deranged or evil. But if you're someone who just went to a doctor because you had anxiety, or in the case of one of the people we spoke to who was suffering from a lot of depression after his wife passed away and had a prescription given to you for depression, well, if the person who wrote that prescription or the person who recommended that a prescription be written feels that that places you as, you might do harm to yourself or somebody else, they can get you put on that list. I assume, and again, this hasn't been proven yet, you should be able to go and challenge that in a court of law. In other states, you have to be adjudicated as being insane before they can take away your rights. In New York, they can just take away your rights, and you have to go get an attorney, go to court, and prove that you're not crazy.
Yeah. Now, the New York Times story, Jazz, points out, gun control supporters argue a wide net is appropriate, given the potentially dire consequences. Brian Malty, Senior National Policy Director for the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence, says if even just one dangerous person had a gun taken away, quote, that's a good thing. Which, again, if a dangerous person has a gun taken away, yes, that would be a good thing. If non-dangerous people have their guns taken away, if non-dangerous people have their rights taken away, well, that's not a good thing. And it seems to me that if Brian Malty and the gun control advocates are not willing to at least acknowledge the potential downside here, Jazz, then we've got we've got some issues. Maybe they don't see it as a downside of having people who aren't dangerous losing their firearms.
Well, this is New York, Cam. That's not a downside of the Democratic Party here. They have enacted incredible bans in New York City, which are still standing for the most part, because we can't even get anybody to get a challenge to go through, and the judges that get appointed by the Democratic leadership here, we're going to need something that goes all the way up like Heller before anything changes significantly. The other game that they play here pretty frequently when you're outside the confines of New York City, and this is another one that I've been through personally, just applying for a permit, and I'm not talking a concealed carry, just a handgun permit, you are informed immediately that there is a standing Freedom of Information law request, and you can look this up on the appropriate website that I have linked there, showing what you have to do to exempt your name from the Freedom of Information law request that is put in by gun control advocates, because they go around and publish the names of everybody who applies for and receives a handgun permit. And they at least had a mechanism in place where you could keep your name off that list. I chose to just say, the heck with it, go ahead, put my name on it. I don't care if you know. But they are able to identify and publish the names of everybody who gets a permit. But mysteriously, when you go and ask for a list of those who have had their permits revoked, suddenly, as if you read my article, I've been going through my own series of Freedom of Information law requests and appeals since May of this year. They have no records that match my request. So they don't know who's been repealed, but boy, they can tell you who's got one at the drop of a hat.
Right. Now, the Times article also says several mental health experts said the data obtained renews their fears that the reporting requirement would discourage patients from seeking help, which is, again, another unintended consequence here. If the Brady campaign's Brian Malte believes that if just one dangerous person is stopped from getting a gun, and that's an unqualified good thing, well, what if people who need help don't get help because they are afraid that they will lose their rights? Dr. Mark Russ, who's director of acute care psychiatry at Zucker Hillside Hospital, which has filed many reports to the state, says the threshold for reporting is so low that it essentially advertises that psychiatrists are mandatory reporters for anybody who expresses any kind of dangerousness.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start off, and I realize this is your show, Cam, but I'm going to disagree with you on one point. I'm not sure that is an unintended consequence. That may, in fact, be an intended consequence, because I've been dealing with these people up here for a lot of years, and if they pass something that, gets... I'll flip the coin around from what the one Brady campaign representative said. If they get just one person to not go apply for a permit and not go get a weapon, then that's a good thing. So if you've got, you can take the reverse of that, and if there's somebody who does have a permit, who owns weapons, who feels, that they need help, that maybe they are suffering from depression, maybe they're suffering from anxiety, they read this news, and now they're going to sit there and think, well, gee, if I go get help, they're going to take my permit away, so I guess I won't go get help. And I think all of this feeds into the frenzy they have here in New York, much more so than anywhere except possibly California and the Pacific Northwest, of just exacerbating any gun problem they can find and then preventing as many people as possible as getting a legal permit. And I think that's how they're playing it, and I think it's working wonderfully for them here.
Talking with Jazz Shaw, who's writing about this at Hot Air. The Times says that there's another concern, the possibility that the database might be used for other purposes or could contain a mistaken identity. I love that state officials, however, emphasize that only a small number of programmers and administrators have access to the entire database, and mistakes, we'll deal with those. At the end of the day, what I find really maybe, and I don't want to say necessarily heartening, but it was some small positive, is that it is not just gun owners and Second Amendment advocates who are expressing some concerns about this. If it were, then again, I think it would be far too easy for the New York Times, for politicians in New York to simply say, oh, well, they're just crazy gun nuts. What do you expect from them? But when you have, again, psychiatrists, when you have mental health professionals who are saying, hey, this isn't a very good way of going about this and making sure that people who are in fact dangerous get that help that they need. Demonizing and sort of ostracizing anybody who seeks mental health, that this could have, again, I'll go back to unintended consequences, or of having these folks not seek treatment. Well, that would be the worst thing that you could possibly hope for. I'm glad that, again, there are other groups out there who are expressing their concerns about this.
I'm glad there are two. I'm a little bit more hopeful than I used to be because New York, for those of your listeners who have never spent any time up here, when you hear the two words together, New York, a lot of people immediately think New York City. And granted, it's a huge city. It's a big slug of population. And they do have the rest of the state outnumbered by about 3-2. But 3-2 is not that huge of a margin, Cam. And what heartens me is that once you get outside of Orange County and the bedroom communities of New York City down there, there's a whole bunch of state to the north and west, which is actually, I'm not even going to say fairly conservative, but fairly sensible. It's a lot of farm country. It's people that grew up with a hunting tradition. I grew up there in the Mohawk Valley. A lot of my friends grew up in the Hudson Valley. I was given my first gun when I was 11 years old. My grandfather used to give you a quarter apiece if you shot woodchucks in his garden. Nobody thought a thing about it. It was pretty sensible. There's still a lot of people like that. They do vote. We don't have enough to outweigh in the state legislature what goes on with New York City because they've got that massive slug of population. But it's also not so dwarfed that we can't keep the conversation going. But what we really need, Cam, and I hope somebody will help us with this, is somebody needs to get a new challenge to the New York Safe Act in light of this new information about this list and whatever more information we can get in the months and years to come, and take another run up the chain at this, because it's just my opinion. I'm not an attorney, but that law is unconstitutional. It's got to be.
Jazz Shaw, listen, man, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's always a pleasure
Anytime,
talking with you.
Cam, just give me a buzz.
All right, Jazz Shaw riding at hot air here on NRA News, Cam and Company.